sir. There's a medium-range ballistic missile launch site and 2 new military encampments.
How far advanced is this?
Sir, we've never seen this kind of an installation before.
Only a few people knew of the existence of the surveillance photographs, much less the terrifying revelations they held. In October 1962, the Soviet Union was constructing nuclear launch sites in Cuba, within range of every major city on the eastern seaboard, including the U.S. capital.
It's hard to realize how frightened they were. They had conversations about evacuating great parts of the United States. They had estimates about how many tens of millions of people would die. They really thought that war was near.
Managing this crisis fell to a rookie president, John F. Kennedy. He was less than 2 years on the job, the youngest man ever elected to the office.
Nothing prepared him for this. The things that got him elected, the acute politician, the charming vote-getter, the money, the glamour, none of it had any bearing at all on his situation.
The qualities that had carried John Kennedy to the presidency, natural rebelliousness, stubborn self-reliance, spectacular self-confidence, had also led him to make mistakes and missteps that helped put the country in mortal danger. His predecessor in the White House, Dwight Eisenhower, had called him Little Boy Blue and thought his wealthy father had bought him the office. The Soviet premier, Nikita Khrushchev, had taken Kennedy's measure at their first meeting a year earlier, and he walked away believing he could get the better of the untested president. If John F. Kennedy doubted himself or quailed at the enormity of the situation, he didn't show it.
He had a very great ability to step back, to be cool, to be detached, to not get sucked in by the passions of the moment, to not just ride the wave.
When he became angry, he tended to become very calm. There was a kind of burning anger in him that he didn't express very openly.
This man was fiercely independent, intellectually independent, fiercely. Kennedy had an unshakable sense of his own skills. He was confident about his ability to come up with the right answer. He wasn't bringing people together in a room to hammer out a consensus. He was bringing people in a room to give him the best information so that he could make the decision.
He had what he called the great man theory of governing. As a consequence, it put a lot of pressure on him.
Now, at a moment of peril and uncertainty, he would be forced to answer the question that had dogged him his entire career. Was he as tough, as smart, as capable as he appeared?
Good evening, my fellow citizens. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
His likes had rarely been seen on Capitol Hill. He looked a kid, skeleton thin, with wrinkled khakis, sneakers, seersucker jackets, shirt tails hanging out. And he lived like one. He was always running late, left a trail of clothes and unfinished meals in his Georgetown townhouse for his valet to clean up. He showed up at his office as little as possible, took scant interest in constituent services, and only middling interest in his committee assignments.
He's very bored by the day-to-day duties of a congressman, and he felt that he really didn't have significant power.
He spent his evenings racing to movie theaters in his convertible, jockeying with the Washington trolley, a different girl in the passenger seat every night. Was it a movie star, the newspapers wondered? A socialite? Another airline hostess?
He's a playboy. He's a handsome young man. You know, he wins that office when he's 29 years old, and he's really a celebrity, and he's enjoying himself. It was a period of great self-indulgence.
Even as he's this reckless, glamorous, playful youth, there was a kind of vulnerability. It's there.
In the middle of the 1947 recess, a half year into his first term, the young congressman traveled to Britain to see his favorite sister, Kathleen. Kick, as the family called her, was the Kennedy most like Jack, independent, rebellious, full of fun. During the visit, Jack collapsed. The diagnosis was grim. A malfunctioning of the adrenal glands called Addison's disease. A doctor in London gave him a year to live. He crossed the Atlantic in a ship's hospital. The family told reporters waiting at the dock that Jack was suffering from a flare-up of malaria he'd contracted in the South Pacific. The good news was Joe Kennedy could afford the latest medicine, and there was a new treatment for Addison's, a potent cortisone-based steroid. It got him out of his deathbed and bought him time. He told one friend he hoped for maybe 10 more years. 8 months later, as he was beginning to regain his strength, 28-year-old Kathleen died in a plane crash.
Jack was devastated. He loved Kick. It was the first time in his life, really, and maybe the only time, where he didn't know what to do.
It did make him a fatalist. He sent the signals of the kind of person who suspected that his time on Earth was limited and that he had to make the most of it.
He's lost a brother. He's lost his sister, Kick. He himself has been near death. There is a sense of mortality that lurks in there, but also drives him, that he's got to accomplish something before he dies, that life is finite.
In his second and third terms in Congress, John Kennedy seemed like a new man, a man in a hurry, always on the lookout for ways to distinguish himself. He exploited his experience in foreign affairs and defense policy, got himself invited to Senate hearings as an expert witness on the military readiness of our European allies, criticized President Harry Truman for inadequate civil defense preparations in the wake of the Russians' first successful atom bomb test.
What interested him was the question of the rising tensions with the Soviet Union, with the civil war in China, with what was happening in Greece and Turkey, and how Harry Truman was responding to the dangers of flowing out of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe.
One of the great advantages of having a very rich father who's willing to spend whatever his sons ask for is that you can go on your own fact-finding missions. You can travel the world. And Jack does that twice in 1951. He talks to the journalists and the military men. He talks to world leaders, and he talks to the opposition.
For 7 weeks, the young congressman traveled through Israel, Iran, Pakistan, India, Singapore, Thailand, French Indochina, Korea, and Japan. He returned home with a new insight. The United States was making few new friends in those places and losing old ones. And Jack Kennedy went on national radio and television to deliver the message.
Meet the press. Our guest of the afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, will be Congressman John F. Kennedy of Boston.
What do we do in Indochina, then?
Well, we tied ourselves completely with the French, and after all, the natives are anxious. You can never defeat the communist movement in Indochina until you get the support of the natives, and you won't get the support of the natives as long as they feel that the French are fighting the communists in order to hold their own power there. And I think
Joe Kennedy had been invited to be on Meet the Press early on. He said, no, I don't want to do it, but why don't you invite my son? At the time, no junior congressman had ever been on. Only the biggest of the biggest stars in Washington were on Meet the Press. But Jack went on.
Mr. Kennedy, when I was in Boston last week, I heard a good deal of talk about you. There were many who thought that you would be the Democratic nominee for the senatorship against Henry Cabot Lodge. Are you going to run?
When Jack told his friends and his colleagues, I'm going to run for the Senate against Henry Cabot Lodge, they were unanimous in saying, don't do it. Nobody can beat a Lodge in Massachusetts. And Lodge is as handsome as you are, speaks as well, is as rich, and is a war hero. Don't even try.
This is a very storied family. As the old saying went, up in Boston, where the Lodges speak only to Cabots and the Cabots speak only to God. And so, can he defeat this Republican? And especially in 1952, it's a Republican year.
His closest advisors told him, don't do it. This isn't your time. Maybe you should think about running for governor of Massachusetts. No. He wanted to run for Senate.
This is a great state with a great past and I believe an even greater future. If elected to the United States Senate, with all of my energies and all of my resources, I will fight to secure that future for the people of this state and for the future of our country. And I know that it is not a one-way street.
Whether 34-year-old John Kennedy was ready or not was an open question in the spring of 1952.
And if elected to the Senate of the United States this November, I will fight for the New England industry, which is so a fight. Can you cut that?
An uphill race against Henry Cabot Lodge was just the sort of challenge the Kennedys liked. Run, Jack, was the word at the family compound. You'll knock his block off. The most gleeful warrior in the clan was Jack's younger brother, 26 years old, barely out of law school, hungry to prove himself. Jack took a chance on brother Bobby and put him in charge of the campaign.
Bobby Kennedy always wanted a role in the family, and he found one. He was the tough guy.
He does not mince words. He's someone who is intent on winning this office for his brother, and if it means stepping on toes, hurting people's feelings, so be it.
Bobby was able to come in and discipline the old hacks who were hanging around the campaign office, tell them to get off their duffs and go out and knock on a few doors, get rid of the ones who were truly useless. He passed around old Joe's money, put down the politicians they wanted to get rid of, made the deals that had to be made. Bobby's doing all the hard work, the dirty work, and it's liberating to Jack. Jack was able to float up there, quoting poetry and being a sort of young Lancelot.
The Kennedy campaign was not shy to exploit the special appeal of the young congressman, the young bachelor congressman. His mother, his sisters, even Bobby's bride Ethel, fanned out into parlors across Massachusetts to sell Jack to a rising new block of voters.
Women were not so involved as they are today, of course. And I think they were very struck by the fact that we were wandering around trying to get them to get out and vote and get their friends to vote. Jack came at the end and gave a very good speech. People were very interested in him because they knew he was the hero and he was young. So they were very interested in how he did all this and what he looked like and everything. He was a very easy candidate to sell because he was good-looking. He had enormous charm. He had a great sense of humor. I mean, he was a real star.
The polls showed Jack trailing the incumbent senator as election day neared, but he was working hard to close the gap. The demand of campaigning statewide, the distances traveled across the rough Massachusetts highways, was punishing, especially on Jack. His mental courage is so much superior to his physical strength, Joe Kennedy wrote. I sometimes wonder what the final result will be. Joe had another fear about his son's health. If Jack's Addison's disease became public, it could cost him the race, maybe even his political future.
Jack was losing weight, but the Kennedys said, well, it's just the campaign. Jack Kennedy always had a suntan. Well, they said, well, he's out and he's getting a suntan. Actually, that was from his treatment, cortisone treatments for Addison's that darkened his skin. They covered all that up.
A man who focuses on the word vigor in his public and private conversations must have in mind a sense of vitality, human vitality as an ideal. Imagine the distance between the reality of his own physical troubles and his ideal of the vigorous, vital leader. Such a smart man would know this distance and understand it, the gap between reality of his own physical being and the image he wanted to project.
Jack kept working down to the wire. He still started his day earlier than his opponent, traveled more miles, campaigned later into the night. He would not allow himself to lose for lack of effort.
In Senate races, Representative John F. Kennedy scores one of the few major Democratic victories, decisively defeating in a tough battle the Republican incumbent Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr.
Well, I guess you're glad it's over, aren't you, Robbie?
I am, Jack.
Okay.
They were beginning to be seen together around town soon after he entered the Senate in 1953. Two dazzling stars in Washington's normally dull firmament. Jack Kennedy was 35 years old, the most sought-after bachelor in the Capitol. Jacqueline Bouvier was a shy 23-year-old beauty, the belle of Manhattan, East Hampton, and Newport. The couple had met at a dinner party 2 years earlier and had been warily circling one another ever since.
She was engaged when she met him, and she broke it off very quickly. She wrote in her diary that she had an intimation that Jack would have a profound and possibly disturbing effect on her life, but he was worth it. She once said to her sister that to her, imagination was the most important thing she wanted to find in a man, and she said that's very difficult to find. From his standpoint, she was very different from the women that he'd known, which were primarily his own sisters. Eunice and Pat and Jean were what one of his friends said, tawny, coltish women. They were energetic, and they were athletic, and they were outspoken. Jackie, by contrast, was cerebral and soft-spoken, and they both had a kind of dry and sly wit.
The romance was carried out largely in the public eye. And when Jackie agreed to marry the senator in the summer of 1953, the press was invited to share the joy.
They were so beautiful, and they were so young. She was very stylish. Somebody in the New York Times wrote that she made the world safe for brunettes again.
Jackie was smart, gorgeous, and although she had not been born into a political family, she knew precisely what to say.
Jack's closest friend, Lem Billings, actually warned her before they were married that she was going to be marrying a man who was known for his womanizing, and that it was unlikely that he would stop. And she later said that instead of being put off by what Billings said, she actually viewed it as kind of a challenge.
After the first year, Jackie was wandering around looking like the survivor of an airplane crash, a friend later remembered. Her new husband did not go out of his way to hide his dalliances from her. Jack Kennedy treated this as a matter of personal liberty and betrayed little guilt. He had this thing about him, said the man who introduced the Kennedys, which was not under control. And it wasn't just his womanizing that stunned Jackie. Politics was sort of my enemy, she confided. We had no home life whatsoever.
Let's go and meet the newlywed. Are you there, Senator?
Yes, right here, Mr. Morrow.
Good evening, sir.
Thank you.
Good evening, Mrs. Kennedy.
Good evening.
I understand that the two of you had a very much publicized...
Whatever her misgivings, Jackie Kennedy had married a politician, and she dutifully accepted her role.
And you first met the senator when you interviewed him?
Well, I interviewed him shortly after I met him.
Well, now, which requires the most diplomacy, to interview senators or to be married to one?
Well,
Being married to one, I guess.
Over on Capitol Hill, however, the Kennedys' star power had less appeal. The young senator's way of being set Democratic leader Lyndon Johnson's teeth to grinding.
Johnson looked at Jack as a person who picked and chose what he would like to do in the Senate. And the picking and choosing wasn't Johnson's idea of how the Senate ran, nor was it the idea of the other Southern moguls who were in charge. Kennedy was the troubadour who came and played before the banquet and left before the dishwashing began. And I think Lyndon talked about him in exactly those terms.
Johnson says Kennedy was pathetic as a congressman and senator. He didn't know how to address the chair, by which he meant he didn't even know the rules.
What irked Johnson was that he couldn't depend on the man. Kennedy was often absent. He ducked the controversial censure vote on Joe McCarthy. And Kennedy's insistence on independence was maddening for the majority leader. Whether it was civil rights or labor legislation, Johnson couldn't count on the Democrat from Massachusetts to vote the party line. Lyndon Johnson could be cutting about Kennedy in front of fellow senators, said he looked like a victim of rickets, and joked about his puny little ankles. What Johnson didn't see was how tough Jack Kennedy had to be just to get out of bed in the morning. By 1954, the drug he took to control his Addison's disease was eating away at his spine.
It came to a point that in order for him to walk from his office to the Senate floor, he had to move across a marble floor. And it was so hard on his back, he needed crutches to allow him to put one foot in front of another without excruciating pain. And so what he decides to do is to have surgery, even though it is a danger to his life.
It requires the fusing of two large sections of the spine and a steel plate inserted there. What makes it risky is that he has Addison's disease, and Addison's disease leads to infections often during surgery.
His father pleads with him, don't do this operation. And he holds out the example of Roosevelt. He said, Roosevelt was president and he was in a wheelchair. You can do it.
Jack said to him, I'd rather be dead than be in a wheelchair or hobbling around in crutches in pain the rest of my life.
Jack goes ahead with the operation. Hours afterwards, an infection develops. Fever spikes, last rites are performed. Jack pulls out, and Joe has him flown to Palm Beach.
He would suffer a series of setbacks in Florida. The 8-inch incision on his back would not close. He developed an abscess, needed a second surgery. The convalescence dragged on into 1955.
Joe watches over him, hires his doctors, his nurses, converts a large part of their Palm Beach house to a nursing facility, and encourages Jack.
The Kennedys told reporters that Jack's back problems were a result of war injuries. They did not disclose his ongoing need of steroids or his Addison's disease. Jack, meanwhile, began work on a second book, a series of essays about United States senators who had risked their political careers bucking convention and party for a greater purpose. With the help of Library of Congress research files, Kennedy, his speechwriter Ted Sorensen, and a handful of Senate staffers produced Profiles in Courage.
For 7-8 months, Jack recuperates, and only after a lengthy period is he able to return to the Senate.
How does it feel to be back? Well, I'm glad to be back here and have a chance to take part in what's going on. I'm sure my wife is, too.
He returns in pain, and he will remain in pain for the rest of his life.
It is now my privilege to present to this convention as a candidate for President of the United States the name of the man uniquely qualified by virtue of his compassion, his conscience, and his courage.
The 1956 Democratic presidential nominee, Adlai Stevenson, gave his party's youngest senator a starring role at the convention, the official nominating speech. And his performance helped ignite a Kennedy for Vice President boom.
Adlai E. Stevenson.
How would you like to be vice president with him? Well, I'd be honored, of course, if chosen, but I've always had my doubts whether I'd ever be chosen.
He wasn't sure he even wanted a place on the ticket. Joe Kennedy had counseled him to steer clear. But Stevenson threw the choice to a floor vote, and Jack Kennedy had a hard time backing down from a challenge, even against the better-known and esteemed Senator Estes Kefauver. Jack Kennedy liked his chances, and he liked the feeling on the convention floor. The delegates took his candidacy seriously.
This whole thing lasted like 24 hours before the vice presidential balloting. And Kennedy makes a real try for it.
Texas proudly casts its vote for that fighting sailor who wears the scars of battle and that fearless senator, the next vice president of the United States, John Kennedy of Massachusetts.
For a moment, it seems actually like he's going to win. But Kefauver beats him. He has to make a concession speech to Kefauver. When he gets up there, he's facing a sea of Kefauver signs. They're all waving in his face. And you look at Kennedy, he's always immaculate. At this moment, he's not immaculate.
Ladies and gentlemen of this convention.
In fact, one point of the collar of his shirt is sticking out. And as he's talking, if you watch his hands, he has the gavel in his hands, and he restlessly turns it around. You saw a young man in defeat, and you also see someone who covers it up so well.
I hope that this convention will make Estes Kefauver's nomination unanimous. Thank you.
Jack was very depressed, very upset. And Bobby was there, and he couldn't cheer him up. And he said, let's call Dad. So I remember when we all went to call Dad, and he said, congratulations. He said to Jack, that's the best thing that ever happened to you. That was magnificent. I don't know how you did that. It was absolutely great. He said, Adlai Stevenson is going nowhere. He said, he's going nowhere, and that's Kefauver's going nowhere. So you just pulled it off, and I can't tell you how wonderful that was. And Jack came out beaming. Beaming.
Joe Kennedy knew what he was talking about. Stevenson lost big to Eisenhower, which made the governor a two-time loser and left the Democratic nomination wide open next time round. Jack Kennedy understood the obstacles to winning the presidency in 1960 and they were not small. He was younger than anybody ever elected to the office. He had few legislative achievements to run on. And then, too, there was his religion. In 1957, a quarter of the electorate still said they were unwilling to vote for a Catholic for president.
There was a fear across the land that Catholics would be controlled by the Pope, that they couldn't think on their own, and therefore they weren't really Americans in the way that Protestants were.
Some in the party argued the country would change in time, that he was still a young man, that he could wait it out. Jack Kennedy thought otherwise. His star turn at the 1956 convention meant he would be taken seriously in 1960. He was not going to let this moment pass.
And I want to be sure that we haven't lost something important in this country, that we haven't gone soft.
He had campaigned across the country for Stevenson in '56.
That we just look to our own private interest.
Let us cut the budget and let us save on foreign aid.
And with his speechwriter Ted Sorensen riding shotgun, he just kept going in 1957.
The reason the communists attack us is because they know when the United States fails, the cause of freedom fails.
There were county chairmen to meet in every state, delegates to woo. Jackie was pregnant most of that year, and nervously so. She'd already had one miscarriage and delivered a stillborn daughter. But her husband rarely stopped traveling. When Kennedy's new back specialist went to Palm Beach for a consultation, she too got the program.
She comes down to there's this huge map of the United States where his father and he are plotting out, his next trips. He's traveling all around the United States trying to make contact with politicians. And she says, well, to do this, you need periods of rest. And he says, well, there's no time for rest. And she says, well, you have to change the schedule. And he said, the schedule will not be changed.
When he was in Washington, Kennedy was always on the lookout for ways to take a stand apart from the other would-be presidents in the Senate. Stuart Symington, Hubert Humphrey, and above all, the Majority Leader, Lyndon Johnson.
People with the fact that this is a strike-breaking, union-busting bill, in my opinion.
Mr. Harper, this bill is not a strike-breaking, union-busting bill. You're the best argument I know for it. Your testimony here this afternoon, your complete indifference to the fact that
He dabbled in domestic issues where he saw opportunity, like in the nationally televised hearings into racketeering in the labor
an
unions.
honest answer might tend to incriminate them. Your complete indifference to it, I think, makes this bill essential.
His chief interest and his focus remained foreign affairs. His father even managed to talk Lyndon Johnson into giving Jack a coveted slot on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee.
When Kennedy said that he would become chairman of the African Subcommittee in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he sort of got a commitment that it would never have to meet. And Johnson thought that was typical of the kind of committee that Kennedy would like to run.
Scenes like this are taking place daily all over Algeria as French colonial troops round up natives by the thousands in a desperate attempt to halt the guerrilla reign of terror that has spread the length and breadth of the colony. 60,000...
The bloody escalation of the three-year-old war for independence in Algeria gave Senator Kennedy a shot at the spotlight, and one that played to his long-held interest in foreign policy.
He identifies himself with a kind of anti-colonial posture, with the idea that the United States is locked in a contest with the Soviet Union for hearts and minds in the third world, in the developing world, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. And he sees Algeria as the case study of the time.
I'm concerned today that we are failing to meet the challenge of imperialism on both counts, both East and West, and thus failing in our responsibilities to the free world and to ourselves.
What Kennedy was saying was, we know that French imperialism is going to die out. The question is, are we going to be on the right side or the wrong side of history? If we make a choice now, we can help shape the outcome. If we align ourselves with Paris until the bitter end, the new generation of leaders in Algeria will remember that and won't talk to us.
I am introducing a resolution which I believe outlines the best hopes for peace and of settlement in Algeria.
Dean Acheson, the former Secretary of State, came out saying this speech was the irresponsible utterings of a juvenile senator because it was throwing aside our alliance with Portugal and France and England in support of Africa and Asia, et cetera.
France was a NATO ally of ours in Europe. Were we going to abandon our ally for the sake of a group of revolutionaries who might turn out to be communists? Kennedy said, yeah, you take that chance, because you want to vote with the future, not with the past.
Senator, what do you feel is the single most critical issue facing the Congress at this time?
Well, I think it's the same issue which has been facing us for 10 years, and that's our relations with the Soviet Union and this question of war and peace, and also the question of whether the uncommitted countries, the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, will move to the communist bloc or our own and turn the balance of power for us or against us. And that's obviously the most important issue today and will be during, I think, our lifetime.
When Sputnik went up by the Russians, the surprise could not have been greater. How did they get ahead of us? And the Russians claimed they invented everything, the car, the plane, penicillin, whatever it was. The Russians would always say, oh no, we had that first. This they had first, and they proved it.
The October 1957 launch of Sputnik, a 184-pound beach ball-sized satellite, spurred an instant jump in Cold War hysteria, and not without reason. If the Soviets were able to launch a satellite into space, could they also reach the U.S. with nuclear-armed missiles? U.S. Air Force bombers went on 24-hour alert. The Eisenhower administration began sending extra planes into Soviet airspace, just to remind Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev who had the upper hand in bombers. When President Eisenhower pursued more and more potent nuclear warheads for the U.S. arsenal, the Soviets answered. 6 in 10 Americans believed nuclear war was imminent and would be catastrophic. Kennedy appeared unruffled by the rising dangers of the Cold War. He increased his travel schedule, running harder state to state, the list of delegates who had supported his vice presidential candidacy tucked in his pocket.
Jack Kennedy could learn on the run. So he's traveling around the country, and he's seeing that politics is changing. He's learning that the power isn't back in Washington anymore. The power is with these younger people in the states, if he can just line them up. For him, he's learning that the old party machinery doesn't work.
He knows that he's got the money to mount an independent campaign, that he's got the charisma without the help of any party bigwigs or any party establishment to get his photo on the cover of Time and the Saturday Evening Post and Look. He begins a change in American politics that is quite significant. He signals the beginning of a move from party dominance and party candidates to the individual, to the personality who can speak to the people, not through the party, but through television and the mass media directly.
Pleasure to have you here, and I want you to meet my daughter Caroline and my wife Jackie.
Joe Kennedy was nudging every editor he knew in 1959. You want to sell magazines? Put Jack and Jackie on your cover. Jackie Kennedy chafed at the requirement of public display. But when the photographers showed up on the Kennedy doorstep, she did not disappoint.
It used to drive Humphrey nuts because he said, every time I go into the supermarket to go shopping for Muriel, I see Red Book, or I see Good Housekeeping, or I see Saturday Evening Post, all with the Kennedys smiling at me on the cover.
Senator, when are you going to drop this public pretense of non-candidacy and frankly admit that you already are seeking the Democratic presidential nomination in 1960?
Well, Mr. Lawrence, I think there's an appropriate time for anyone to make a decision and a final announcement as to whether he's going to be a candidate.
A very great ability to step back, to be cool, to be detached, to not get sucked in by the passions of the moment, to not just ride the wave.
When he became angry, he tended to become very calm. There was a kind of burning anger in him that he didn't express very openly.
This man was fiercely independent, intellectually independent, fiercely. Kennedy had an unshakable sense of his own skills. He was confident about his ability to come up with the right answer. He wasn't bringing people together in a room to hammer out a consensus. He was bringing people in a room to give him the best information so that he could make the decision.
He had what he called the great man theory of governing. As a consequence, it put a lot of pressure on him.
Now, at a moment of peril and uncertainty, he would be forced to answer the question that had dogged him his entire career. Was he as tough, as smart, as capable as he appeared?
Good evening, my fellow citizens. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
His likes had rarely been seen on the eastern seaboard, including the U.S. Capitol.
It's hard to realize how frightened they were. They had conversations about evacuating great parts of the United States. They had estimates about how many tens of millions of people would die. They really thought that war was near.
Managing this crisis fell to a rookie president, John F. Kennedy. He was less than 2 years on the job, the youngest man ever elected to the office.
Nothing prepared him for this. The things that got him elected, the acute politician, the charming vote-getter, the money, the glamour, none of it had any bearing at all on his situation.
The qualities that had carried John Kennedy to the presidency, natural rebelliousness, stubborn self-reliance, spectacular self-confidence, had also led him to make mistakes and missteps that helped put the country in mortal danger. His predecessor in the White House, Dwight Eisenhower, had called him Little Boy Blue and thought his wealthy father had bought him the office. The Soviet premier, Nikita Khrushchev, had taken Kennedy's measure at their first meeting a year earlier, and he walked away believing he could get the better of the untested president. If John F. Kennedy doubted himself or quailed at the enormity of the situation, he didn't show it.
He had
to see his favorite sister, Kathleen. Kick, as the family called her, was the Kennedy most like Jack, independent, rebellious, full of fun. During the visit, Jack collapsed. The diagnosis was grim. A malfunctioning of the adrenal glands called Addison's disease. A doctor in London gave him a year to live. He crossed the Atlantic in a ship's hospital. The family told reporters waiting at the dock that Jack was suffering from a flare-up of malaria he'd contracted in the South Pacific. The good news was Joe Kennedy could afford the latest medicine, and there was a new treatment for Addison's, a potent cortisone-based steroid. It got him out of his deathbed and bought him time. He told one friend he hoped for maybe 10 more years. 8 months later, as he was beginning to regain his strength, 28-year-old Kathleen died in a plane crash.
Jack was devastated. He loved Kick. It was the first time in his life, really, and maybe the only time, where he didn't know what to do.
It did make him a fatalist.
Result of the photography taken someone's hair. There's a medium-range ballistic missile launch site and 2 new military encampments.
How far advanced is this?
Sir, we've never seen this kind of an installation before.
Only a few people knew of the existence of the surveillance photographs, much less the terrifying revelations they held. In October 1962, the Soviet Union was constructing nuclear launch sites in Cuba, within range of every major city on Capitol Hill. He looked a kid, skeleton thin, with wrinkled khakis, sneakers, seersucker jackets, shirt tails hanging out. And he lived like one. He was always running late, left a trail of clothes and unfinished meals in his Georgetown townhouse for his valet to clean up. He showed up at his office as little as possible, took scant interest in constituent services, and only middling interest in his committee assignments.
He's very bored by the day-to-day duties of a congressman, and he felt that he really didn't have significant power.
He spent his evenings racing to movie theaters in his convertible, jockeying with the Washington trolley, a different girl in the passenger seat every night. Was it a movie star, the newspapers wondered? A socialite? Another airline hostess?
He's a playboy. He's a handsome young man. You know, he wins that office when he's 29 years old, and he's really a celebrity, and he's enjoying himself. It was a period of great self-indulgence.
Even as he's this reckless, glamorous, playful youth, there was a kind of vulnerability. It's there.
In the middle of the 1947 recess, a half year into his first term, the young congressman traveled to Britain